Well, first of all, I want to thank Watkins for giving me the opportunity of sharing this talk today on the static alignments. It's a book that I've enjoyed very much. It's a book that I was involved in the making, so I'm very pleased to see it. It comes, of course, from Jerusalem Press, and Jerusalem Press, they specialise in books about Austin Osman's Spare. There's a sort of trademark. Their books are beautifully designed with rich imagery, and this one is no exception. I just want to very quickly, for a bit of context, go through a few of their previous titles. This is Cockney Visionary. This came out in 2010, and it was to tie in with the Spare exhibition of that year at the Continuum Museum. I don't know how many people here at the talk today went along to that, but it was an extremely good exhibition. They also issued, or rather republished, the Book of Pleasure in 2011. That was characterized by very high quality reproductions of Spare's drawings in there. They also did refractions, and that was, as you can tell by the subtitles that were Fallen Visionary, it was actually connected with the Continuum Museum exhibition. This one here, the Catalpa monographs, by basically the leading author of the static alignments, that was William Wallace. That came out in 2015. So onto the book that we're talking about today, the static alignments, Austin Osman Spare's School of Draughtsmanship. As I say, it was one of several books that Jerusalem Press published by William Wallace. William has been immersed in Spare's work for many years now. He knew Spare's former pupil, Frank Letchford, very well over many years. And on Frank's death, he became, I believe, executor of the estate. He supervised the sale of Frank's collection of drawings, paintings, and sketchbooks by Spare, and he inherited Frank's papers. And he's drawn on Frank's papers in quite a few of his books. In the late 1980s, as I say, William's been around for a long time, haven't we all really? In the late 1980s, he published two very fine monographs, the early works of Austin Osman Spare, 1900 to 1919, and the later works of Austin Spare, 1917 to 1956. I remember those books coming out at the time. Well, not at the time. I wasn't very much interested in Spare, but I did actually manage to get hold of them a bit later on in the 1990s, and I found them very exciting works. Many years later, in 2015, these were republished in a revised and expanded form by Jerusalem Press as the Catalpa monographs. William Wallace has a very sound grasp of Spare's work, and very importantly, he places it in the context of art history, as well as the history of mysticism, comparative religion, and philosophy. He's got two extremely fine and insightful essays in this book. The first of these he titles The Line of Evolution and Convolution. This serves as an introduction to Spare's notes for his drawing school. The second essay, A Strange Vessel in Sparian Mathematics, goes into more detail about how rooted Spare's artwork techniques were in Euclid and solid geometry. As well as discussing the background to Spare's School of Draftsmanship, which is fascinating in itself, William Wallace also discusses Spare's interest in geometry as the basis for perspective and proportion. This was actually quite an eye-opener for me to read, because I hadn't appreciated just how rooted Spare's work was in such consideration. Interestingly enough, at the moment, one of my publishing projects that I have on is publishing across several volumes the collected works of Fraser Occult, edited by Henrik Bogdan. And whilst I was doing some proofreading of the typesetting for the Anatomy of the Body of God, I came across an interesting quote in there by Occult. He says, Plato informs us in his Republic, geometry, rightly treated, is the knowledge of the eternal. So such ideas have been around for a long time. As a young man, Spare went to Lambeth's School of Arts, who offered tuition in solid geometry. It seems that Spare won a prize for an essay on solid geometry, but unfortunately, either it's not survived or it's yet to surface. Wallace tells us that, and I quote, from 1920 onwards, Spare had pupils of both sexes and all ages and varied abilities, many of them ordinary folk who could not draw a line until he took them in hand. After a few lessons, their confidence grew, and even if they did not become draftsmen, their knowledge of and enthusiasm for the arts was awakened. He's quoting here from Frank Letchford, from an early draft of his memoir, The Magician of Southwark. This was later renamed Michelangelo in a Teacup by the eventual publisher. After quoting this, Wallace goes on to say, but the above quote from The Magician of Southwark reveals that there was a proto-AOS school of draftsmanship in existence before the 1930s. Also, that teaching does seem to have commenced when he was in his 30s, just after the Great War. That's actually quite interesting to note, because this thing that's on the screen right now is actually his prospectus from 1939. But it seems actually that he was teaching people to draw and paint, teaching them art techniques from a much earlier time. But certainly Spare started his School of Draftsmanship formally in 1937. He held an exhibition in that year, 1937, and the catalogue for the exhibition included an introductory essay, The Art of Austin Spare, by Spare's friend G.S. Sandilands. Sandilands was also for a while Spare's framer, I believe. In the course of the essay, Sandilands remarks, quite recently, Spare began to teach drawing. And I think he means that on a formal basis, which is what we've got here. The same catalogue also includes a selection of opinions about Spare, testimonies, and it includes the following from one of his pupils in his School of Draftsmanship. Anonymized, of course, goes on to say, I am a doctor interested in art. A friend told me about Spare's teaching and said I should go along. I should be eternally grateful that I did. As Spare knew I should never practice art, he taught me by lecture and demonstration. They were the most amazing discourses I have ever heard. His lucidity in handling the most obscure subjects is a real pleasure because he can and does demonstrate everything. He is a natural psychologist. He invented 3 complexes to explain certain truths. Firstly, the tartan complex to explain why certain things appear more beautiful than others. Secondly, the wood tree complex to explain chaotic and uncoordinated observation. And then thirdly, the self-fear complex to explain intellectual myopia, that is, seeing things unrelated. and our preference for lies instead of truth. This is all very briefly. They explain very much more. Well, that's not a bad commendation, is it? Spare had an exhibition the following year in 1938. He was very prolific. And the catalogue for that exhibition included at the back a prospectus for Spare's School of Draftsmanship early the following year in 1939. That's what we've got here. But we've also got a press clipping that was reproduced. It doesn't actually give a date, could be 37, could be 38. Father of Surrealism, he's a Cockney. This was actually published in the Daily Express, and I do apologise for the poor reproduction. I think that basically I scanned from a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy, but the closing paragraph is quite interesting, and I quote, "What happens is that something is transmitted. I don't know where from, maybe from the dead, or from our own past experiences, or from other lives we have lived. I take people from the streets and teach them to do this. They become fine draftsmen. The principles I am teaching will be adopted by the world one day. We have got to the limits of the conscious mind. We must develop the subconscious." So back to the 1939 prospectus, which, as I say, was at the back of the 1938 catalogue. You'll see that the School of Draftsmanship was due to run from just the 1st of January to May the 30th. Spare lists courses. I was very surprised to see that the second of the courses, which is oil painting course. The reason I was very surprised is that there are very few paintings in oil by Spare. It's not a medium that he liked. I think it's because it was quite slow drying, whereas he actually prefers swift line and things like that. And there's also, he also did museum tours, though we don't, of course, know how many people took that up. And it seems actually that he was willing to visit people's homes as a lecturer demonstrating. A note at the end of the notice says results are guaranteed. And it's quite interesting, actually, that closing piece, presumably by Spare. The various theses in form and draftsmanship, as created and taught by Austin Spare, will shortly obtain throughout the whole world. Not yet 2 years old, the school is already famous, and every student a living reference, which reinforces the idea, I think, that the formal Austin Spare's School of Draftsmanship did indeed start in 1937, but it had been preceded by years of experience of Spare, of teaching students, which of course makes perfect sense. I mean, only a fool would leap in and try and do this sort of thing if they haven't had previous experience at teaching people individually. We don't get any more, or we appear not to have any more School of Draftsmanship for a few years. Not surprisingly, really, because of course war broke out towards the end of 1939. Even though, you know, for the first few months it was what is referred to as false war or the quiet war. I can't quite remember the exact wording. Certainly Spare would have been in no position, I think, to give teaching to anybody because he was badly injured in May 1940, I think it was, whilst he was on fire watching duty. And it took him a few years to kind of recover the use of one of his hands sufficiently for him to actually be able to paint and draw as well as he used to. We do know, though, that Spare issued prospectuses for his School of Draftsmanship for 1945 and 1946, and these are actually taken from the Static Alignments book, Telltale Sign Courses. I didn't snowflake out Stephen's gloss at the bottom of the left-hand picture. They're pretty similar, really. And in fact, I mean, the telltale giveaway is the one on the right. You can see that he's just changed the 45 to 46 in ink. Added a few other things. Wallace, in connection with this, William Wallace, mustn't be so informal here. William Wallace quotes from Spare, writing to Frank Letchford in April 1946, where he says, "Now taking pupils again, I'm very successful with the backward and have thought of some quite new techniques for the more advanced." Spare had another exhibition in 1947 at the Archer Gallery in London. And Dennis Bardens wrote the introduction to the catalogue of this exhibition. And he makes interesting remarks about Spare's techniques, particularly Siderealism, which really Spare had introduced in 1930 into his corpus of work. Bardens says, "Many will remark on the queer perspective of many of these pictures. This is deliberate and based on a geometric thesis. Spare believes that by combining two or more perspectives of the same object, say one front and one side, certain aesthetic qualities are obtained." Once again, in this quote, you have the reference to geometry. Bardens then goes on to quote Spare. "Through attenuation, either horizontal, perpendicular, or oblique, there occurs a natural emphasis of the rhythm of aesthetic values inherent in form, but usually obscured." Bardens then continues, "By the use of these complex perspectives, almost stereoscopic values may be obtained. The new orientation of perspective does not, strangely enough, interfere with likeness." And just got a couple of pictures to illustrate this. This first one, it's a watercolor from Spare's 1930 exhibition, which is, as far as I know, the first exhibition that he introduced these siderealized pictures. There were a number of portraits, and they're watercolors, and they are each entitled to something experimenting relativity. Most were of film stars, and they were taken from film posters of the day. Now, this one here, I'm sure there's not anybody in this Zoom conference, which no doubt spans the whole globe, who doesn't recognise that as Betty Davis. And if you don't, see me afterwards. Now, both images are distorted or attenuated. I mean, for instance, the one on the right, I've never seen a photograph of Betty Davis that suggests that she had as long a neck as that. But the face, although attenuated itself, although distorted itself, it's still very recognisably Betty Davis, as is the rather beautiful perspective with her on the left. The second one, this, by contrast, is a watercolour from, I believe, the early 1950s, and it's Steffi Grant, and there's quite a few pictures around of Steffi Grant at that time, and although beautifully siderealized, beautifully attenuated, having known her for quite a few years, I could testify to the fact that she didn't look like that. But the likeness is still very close. It's recognisable as Steffi Grant. So that's very much in line with what Bardens is saying there. Now, Spare carried on teaching well into the 1950s. Wallace again quotes from Frank Letchford. And he says, Spare was suggesting lessons to Letchford as late as the 15th of February 1955. He means in a letter of 15th of February 55. For Frank coming directly from work to attend for 1.5 hours per week. Well, I mean, 1955, that's sort of, it's in the time frame when Spare was actually starting to fall seriously ill. So it might well be Frank was the last person to receive any lessons from Spare. Well, what I want to go on to now is to talk about some of the thoughts and insights that have arisen in me from reading this book. And a lot's been suggested to me by the second essay by William Wallace in this book called A Strange Vessel in Sparian Mathematics. Now, William Wallace starts his essay with a very interesting quote from Gustav Meyrink in his novel, The Angel of the West Window. And he puts this in the mouth of the character of Dr. John Dee, who is central to the book. And what Dee says is, I buried myself in the study of Euclid, but there is one thing that the father of geometry failed to understand. Our world is not limited to his 3 dimensions, length, breadth, and height. For many years, I've been close to working out a theory of the 4th dimension. The world is not bounded by our 5 senses, not even our own nature is. As I say, this is Gustav Meyrink, the character of Dr. John Dee. Now, when I read this, it reminded me of a passage by Spare from the late writings of Spare that the Grants included in Zoth Speaks. And the passage is, I believe in the life, in the flesh of infinite variety. We are eternity with, as now, a fleeting and fluxing consciousness. Possibilities of being are limitless because there is no total of experience or memory. Our potentialities are within this all spaciousness, reined in by dimensionals and senses. Well, this brings us to what I consider the central core of Spare. Our nature, our identity, who we are, where we came from, and where we might be going. This is a pastel drawing from 1928 or 1929, and it was included in Spare's 1929 exhibition. It's called The Evolution of the Human Race, and it shows from the bottom evolution from supposedly primitive forms of life, toadstools, fish, reptiles, snakes, the whole lot really, going up through so-called primitive people, and then you've got the central column ascending from beast, that's the skull of an ox, and then going up through so-called primitive man, up through what I presume is a woman from a few hundred years ago, to finally an Einstein-like figure at the top, which presumably indicates what was then deemed to be the acme of intellect or civilization. A very interesting picture. Also this one is called Slipstream of Memory, and it's a 1953 drawing by Spare that appeared in his 53 exhibition. Incredibly enough, it didn't sell, and so it was carried forward to his 1955 exhibition. It does bring to mind, at least for me, something that he wrote in the catalogue for his 1947 exhibition. By turning my head quickly and involuntarily, I can always see my alter ego, familiars, or the gangs of elementals that partly constitute my being. It also brings to mind a passage, again, another passage from one of his 1950s manuscripts included in Zoss Speaks, where he says, identity is an obsession, a composite of personalities, all counterfeiting, a favulated ego, a resurging catacomb wherein the phantom-like demiurguses seek in us their reality. It also brings to mind, not just the picture, but these passages by Spare, it also brings to mind the Buddhist notion that there is no such thing as an individual self. Rather, there is a stream of perception from which is fabricated the sense of an individual self. Right, the third picture is mind and body. This, again, was a 1953 pastel by Spare, pastel on board, and he's used the line of the board incredibly skillfully in this picture. It just kind of shows echoes of a head falling away. And he commented on this picture in the catalogue for the 1953 exhibition. I quote, mind and body, or the contexture of consciousness. The snake symbol is energy and the unconsciousness. The woman's head is something we call subconsciousness, the more fertile part. The male head symbolizes the consciousness and the body. Many consider, and others more glibly think, of the subconsciousness as being inferior to normal consciousness, whereas it is the mind, or Hidean omnisciences, with elations reaching across the rafters of firmament, as nerves, veins, and arteries. The ego is merely the echolalia, echopraxia of something greater. Other heads represent the emotional range, instincts, and past lives. At the base, the bestmass, benthos, and forms we evolve through and revert to. The whole picture, a symbol of the great dualities, mind and body, male and female. Now, in this passage I've quoted, Spare does betray his love of archaic terms and obscure terms. Echolalia, basically that term echolalia, echopraxia. Well, echolalia is the involuntary repetition of someone else's conversation. Echopraxia, the involuntary imitation of the actions of someone else. What Spare's saying here is that we're just echoing we're just echoing something more primordial, that we're just puppets. He says somewhere else that we're like people that have fallen into drunkenness. Elations means the influences, and these are the delicately coloured lines that is drawn on the board. Benthos is the animals and the plants that we see at the bottom of the picture. It comes from the Greek benthos, depth of the sea. And then finally, I want to show you a pastel drawing of 1955. In his 1955 exhibition, Spare had several series of pictures, each with a series title. And the first series was called Contextual Being, consisting of 12 pictures. This picture, Background of Prescience, came from Contextual Being, but it's also the first picture that occurred in that series. So what did Spare mean by contexture being? Well, contexture is defined as the arrangement and union of the constituent parts of anything, the constitution of the structure. An interwoven structure or a fabric, the act of weaving together, the process or manner of being woven together. So Spare's just sort of emphasizing this whole series that they're all going to be about the fabric of being, the fabric of consciousness. So in this picture, once again, we see on the upper right hand side, we see again so-called primitive forms, fish, reptiles. There's even a cat. I think some of us might balk at the idea that cats are primitive forms. There's a snake in there, there's a starfish. And then basically sort of we've got the what is fundamentally the evolution of the human race. We've got a tumble of heads coming from an origin. The upper part of the picture seems to be a Greek mask, and the whole thing is tumbling from so-called primitive man, the first couple of heads, gradually going, I suppose, through the Middle Ages, and culminating in these three heads at the bottom, which are just kind of late 40s, early 50s movie stars. I mean, that one is recognisably Rita Hayworth. That one over there, recognisably Clara Bow. I don't recognise the chap in the middle. Somebody did tell me once, but I've forgotten. Give myself away right there. There's a couple of quotes from Spare, I think, that have got something to like to throw on that. He says, I think it's in the Book of Pleasure, know the subconsciousness to be an epitome of all experience and wisdom, past incarnations of men, animals, birds, vegetable life, etc., etc. Everything that exists, has, and ever will exist. So you get an image of a continuum, and we are that continuum, but we cling to the notion that we've got individual existence. So the vision is not personal but cosmic. And there's another quote. This one comes from Focus of Life. He says, "O Zos, thou shalt live in millions of forms, and every conceivable thing shall happen to thee." Again, this reinforces the notion of the quotes from the Book of Pleasure. Well, so I want to move on to the second of themes that kind of got me going and sparked me off, whatever terminology you want to use. Elsewhere in his essay, we're still talking about this essay at the back of the book. William Wallace says, to Dürer, the essence of true form was founded in primary mathematical figures, line, circle, cone, and conic sections, factors which repeatedly surface in Spare's work. Now, this was very suggestive to me because for many years now, this has absolutely fascinated me about Spare, particularly lines and angles that occur in some of Spare's work. This one here, this is a drawing by Spare that I think he sent to Grant, I'm not sure. And I think it's just developing this idea of lines and angles because you can see them. You can see them in the bottom half of the picture. Lots and lots of triangles and lines. I mean, interestingly enough, Spare calls it formula for hasting transference from the twin ego. And it is quite interesting. Oh, I'll come on to another picture in a minute and I'll remind you of that. Make sure you've been paying attention. Well, in his 1955 exhibition, Spare had a series of pictures called Magical Staley. And a number of these pictures had this congeries of lines and angles in the center of the picture. And this one here, called For Protection from Evil People, we could all do with a bit of that, couldn't we? Which Spare did in 1954, is a wonderful example of that. This other one, though, Man is a Bundle of Ids. This was used at the frontispiece. This is a frontispiece for the Ninth Arch by Kenneth Grant. And it first saw the light of day, I think, in one of the weekly installments of the encyclopedias, I think, later on in Grant's Images and Oracles and Osman Spare. Now, this one is a bit more advanced than Staley's in that we haven't just got the arrangement of lines and angles at the top, but we've got a cone depending from it, and we know it's a cone because Spare has very helpfully drawn the bottom of it. Now, out from that, we've got, or possibly going into it, we've got another strange thing. We know, though, that's not a cone because towards at the bottom left of the picture, we can see that it's ending. It looks almost like a plank of wood. This is another picture from the Contextual of Being series. Man's a Bundle of Ids. Many years ago, I came across a very interesting. Spare actually did quite a few preliminary sketches for this picture, concentrating actually on this arrangement of lines and angles and cones. And this is one of them. This is 1953, probably 1954, I think. And it's interesting in that the central character in Man is a Bundle of Ids. Incidentally, one thing I forgot to draw your attention to is this woman, for want of a better word here, obviously, woman of one's dreams, I suppose. This woman has got a very exaggerated hourglass figure, and it's almost the double cone, the figure of 8, which is very interesting when set, when set against the background of cones. But anyway, the central figure's got a much more sort of African cast here. But as I say, you've got the same congeries, you've got the same lines, angles, a projected cone, a projected triangle, which is either coming from the cone or I think it's actually going into the cone. And it's very interesting. So what's going on here? What's Spare trying to say with this? Puzzled the hell out of me for quite a long time. And then a number of years ago, I came across a couple of bookworks that Spare had done in 1905 and 1906. And this is a picture from one of them. This basically was drawn from a photograph of a Shinto priest. I know because I've actually seen the photograph. Although it has to be said, I don't think Shinto priests, by and large, had large snails as pets with them, let alone on a strange quasi skateboard contraption. But the really, really interesting thing about this picture, and in the first of these grimoires, it actually occurs in every picture in the grimoire. I've just selected one to show you. You seem to have an earlier form. You seem to have a kind of skeleton, a kind of preliminary sketch, if you like, of the finished picture. I mean, you can see here, this shape mimicking this helmet, for instance. Sorry, I sort of keep forgetting you can't see when I'm eating. And it's actually coming from a point. And I think that that is form emerging from the Kia, emerging from the plenum, the or, the nothing, the abyss, call it what you will, the very beginning of form. And then it's gradually taking shape. Spare used to refer to these shapes as karmas. A little confusing at first because it's not really the definition of karma that we use today. I see that time's getting on, so I'm just going to finish up with the third thing that was really sparked off for me was considerations of the best mass, which again I've identified over the years as a really central feature of Spare. It was sparked off by two automatic drawings from 1933 that Stephen Hochin pulled into the book. And what I love about these automatic drawings by Spare is that they just seem to be multitudinous form arising. And this actually brings to mind for me the best mass, whereby form arises, it takes shape, it flourishes for a while in its shape, it decays, it falls back to re-emerge in other shapes, other forms. And this just goes on and on and on. And of course, as human beings, we get attached to specific shapes. I mean, in some ways, I'm quite attached to mine, I must admit. But I mean, for instance, my father might die, or my mother might die. and I'm very grief-stricken. But you know, the fact is, the way of the world is that things arise, things flourish, they fall back, and then they give birth to other things. It's multitudinous form, which is arising from a plenum, which is arising, horrible terminology, but one can actually say arising from mind stuff. And this is a 1954 pastel, again from the 1955 exhibition. And to my mind, that globe, top right of the picture, towards which a form looking a little bit like a Roman centurion possibly is melting or possibly emerging. I think that Spare is depicting there the best mass. Spare is depicting there the churn of form, sinuous arabesques arising, and shifting shimmering colours flowing outwards in waves in form. And it's given rise to this profusion of imagery that we see in this picture, which is called Sacred and Profane. 1954 pastel on board. And I'd love to talk a lot more about the best mass, but I'm not going to, because I'll be here all night if I do. But I just think it's extremely important to Spare. This important thing about Spare is eternal transformation, eternal change. Nothing stands still. So I'd like to think that I've conveyed a bit of an insight into the static alignments tonight. As I say, I think it's an excellent book and well worth going out, buying, absorbing, and sparking lots and lots of insights. Thank you very much. I've been Michael Staley, and you've been a wonderful audience. Curiously enough, I don't think he had specific influences in his very early work. You can see that at one time he was under the spell of Beardsley. You can see that. There's quite a few of these pen and inks from early on in the century, and you can see the Beardsley influence. I think, though, that to be honest, he was much more influenced by movements in the artwork in general. I don't think there were any of his peers that influenced him. He wasn't averse to doing mischievous pastiches. There's a very nice Picasso pastiche that appears in I think it's the 1953 exhibition. I don't think he had specific influences, though, to be honest. I think he was too much of his own man. But as I say, as I said earlier, he was drawing on he was drawing really on a continuum of artistic work across the centuries, indeed across thousands of years. I once came across some author who maintained that Spare had plagiarized illustrated letters, and I looked at it, and I thought, well, you can only do so much with illustrated letters, can't you? Yes, I think it did. I think, though, more to the point, he attended the Lambeth School of Art, and that included a course in solid geometry. We do know also that Spare was very well read, and you can see it in some of his early work. I mean, for instance, there's the beginnings of a Spare Tarot surfaced a few years ago. The two early bookworks that were published as two grimoires were very interesting. They show Spare experimenting with, even with ceremonial magic, Golden Dawn techniques, correspondences, tarot, and so forth. Yes, I think it very likely indeed that Spare did actually study, I mean, as well as receiving lessons in these things from London School of Art, I'm sure that he did a lot of reading. I mean, yes, I mean, he was very largely a self-taught man, but by the same token, you have to remember that he did go to these art schools and he did receive training, and he did receive information that he would later follow up.
That's excellent. I should mention that the essay by William Wallace that's in this book actually touches a little bit on Kabbalistic kind of references to sacred geometry and so on.
Yes, it does. I mean, but see, again, I mean, certainly later Spare, there's no evidence of interest in the Kabbalah as we know it, you know, i.e. numbers. Didn't seem to have any interest really in the tree of life. But as I say, these bookworks from earlier on in the century do show him experimenting. I mean, as I was leafing through this second bookworks, when I first came across them, I was quite struck by the fact that there was a picture of a cone or something like that in motion, you know, with arrows to indicate motion. And within the cone was the number 97. Now, why that struck me quite so forcefully is because a strong interest of mine for many, many years has been the Amelantra working by Crowley. And that at one time was subtitled Liber 97. So I was actually quite surprised. But, well, no, I wasn't surprised. I was quite thunderstruck, actually. But no, I mean, to be honest, to my mind, there's not that much of an interest in Kabbalah in Spare. I kind of have the impression that he did a lot of youthful experimentation, and then actually went with what he wanted to go with and discarded what he didn't. I think he was much more interested in proportion than he was in the sort of numbers that we associate with the Kabbalah. Although, having said that, I'm well aware that through works like, say, William Sterling's The Canon, proportion does enter into it. I hope that's answered your question. Yeah, I mean, basically, when I first approached Spare's writing, because of that very thing, and not just actually some of the obscure terminology, but his, shall we say, somewhat tortuous grasp of grammar, syntax, and punctuation, I found it very, very difficult. And once I got past that, I was still struck by this obscure, archaic terminology that creeps in. But when you check it out, it's actually very, very appropriate. I mean, you know, when you check out things like echolalia, echopraxia, you can see exactly why Spare used that term, because he could have just used a few more words and explained to every woman and her husband exactly what the term meant. But, you know, why use 10 words when one will do? And if it means that you have to go to a dictionary, well, you know, you are educating yourself. I mean, you see, that's another thing. You won't even find echolalia in quite a few dictionaries. It's considered a bit too obscure, because of course, it's actually a medical come psychiatric term, isn't it? Echolalia, echoing someone else's conversation, echopraxia. mimicking somebody else's movements or posture. But he just kind of did that all the time, and it's always fascinating. I mean, I'm the sort of person that tends to follow words up when I come across a word that I don't use, even if it's in a novel, even though it's going to interrupt the flow. I still like to go and check out, you know, what it is. But every time that I've actually finally got to the bottom of what spare means by a term, I can see that it's very, very appropriate. I think in some ways, spare was quite old-fashioned. Every now and then, for instance, in his exhibition catalogues, he does hark on about how he remembers the old East End, you know, and the NAFTA flares and the costermongers and things like that. And a bit like in another way, I mean, another person who perhaps shared that predilection, although not the predilection for the archaic terminology, but certainly the predilection for what you might call the bygone age, was H.P. Lovecraft. You know, if you read his letters, you know, you definitely get the impression in some ways of a young fogey. Really fascinating, you know, somebody who would have been much more comfortable 200 or 300 years earlier, possibly in, you know, the sort of Dr. Johnson age, you know, I say to you, sir, you know, formal disquisition, that sort of thing. It was actually William Wallace's reference to Advaita Vedanta in a footnote to his introductory essay, I think footnote in chapter 3, I think it is, that really caught my attention, because Advaita Vedanta has been almost an obsession of mine for many years now, and I'd always felt that Spare's work was very, very close to Advaita Vedanta. I was really struck by that observation. You know, I thought, oh, it's not just me after all. Well, to be honest, I, in the first instance, would go to Spare himself. I'd go to Zoff Speaks, because the reason why Zoff Speaks is so valuable is because it's basically it's written by two people who knew Spare for a number of years. You've got that riveting diary and letter section at first, and then after that you've got the presentation of Spare's writings, and you've got some interesting introductions by Kenneth, and you do become aware of what a widely and deeply read person Spare was. But I can't think of any book really that would give you that sort of grounding in what sort of philosophies Spare went through. You might be able to glean that from William Wallace, from Phil Baker's biography. I've not read that for many, many years now, so I can't remember, to be honest. Spare was also very impressed by Weihanger's work on the as if, which he was introduced to in 1949. And you can tell it made a big impression on him, because references to the as if creep into his later work. Quite a few of the Logomachy oracles, for instance, quite a few of the sections in his later writings. He, in an early age, he was very fond of the Tao Te Ching. I do know that. As I say, he was very widely read. Having said that, you've got to take into account that much more has been published since his formative years, and indeed since his death, than was available at the time. So we know a lot more, I think, about comparative mysticism, comparative religion, etc. But it'd be very nice if somebody actually wrote a book setting this out. I think personally it's hard to get hold of, but Gavin Semple's book on Zoskia that came out sometime in the early to mid 1990s, I believe, from Volga. I think that will give you an idea. And I think also I'd recommend William Wallace's two monographs that I mentioned earlier, and that were republished in expanded form as the Catalpa monographs, because in there, as I remember, because again it's quite a few years ago that I read them, but William does go into quite a lot of that ground, covers quite a lot of that territory about what sort of influences are discernible in Spare's work from a philosophical perspective. But there wasn't a lot really, to be honest. Spare didn't think very much of her work, which, you know, I kind of find quite extraordinary. Actually. So I don't think there's a great deal. And in fact, to be honest, you also can't see that much of an influence in Steffi's work, I don't think, from Spare. I mean, I got to know Steffi a lot better in the years after Kenneth died. And from the way that she used to talk about Spare, you know, always very admiringly, very fondly, she clearly thought the world of him. She thought he was marvelous, but I think she concentrated more, I think, on his written work. I don't really think, I mean, Steffi Grant's work, I suppose one could bear in mind the pen and inks that are included in most of the Typhonian trilogies. But again, when you look at it closely, I don't think there's an awful lot of Spare's influence in there. I mean, for instance, I would compare it with another, with say Andrew Chumley. Now in Chumley's drawings, you can actually much more clearly see the influence of Spare than you can in Steffi's work. That's just my opinion. But that's how I feel. I don't personally think that Spare had a great deal of influence on her work. I mean, for instance, she never gets Siderealism in Steffi's work. Philosophical underpinnings. See, I don't really think he had very much. I think, like many people of his age, he was very impressed with Nietzsche. You know, well, I mean, when I say of his age, I mean Nietzsche does actually have quite an extraordinary following even today, I think. I think that he was much more interested in forging his own way. I think that Spare adopted the technique that we all do, really, which is that we all take influences from various sources and we transmute it via our own practical experience to actually distill something inherent, something unique to us. And other people take that as you know, one influence amongst the myriad, and they perform similar things, really. So I don't think Spare had, I mean, my guess is that he would have been attracted to the German idealists, for instance, you know, Schopenhauer, etc., 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 Kant, that sort of thing. But I don't think that there was any. I don't think there was any one philosopher that had an influence on him. I think he would have just taken suggestions or steers or opinions or insights from other people, whether it's philosophy, mysticism, religious practice, etc. I mean, I kind of find, personally, I find terms like ultra-realism or postmodernism to be kind of very peculiar terms. You know, I mean, how can anything be postmodern, for instance? You know, it's a bit of a silly term. And ultra-realism, you know, either things are real or they're not. I don't really see that it can have gradations of realism, really. I feel a bit like Alan Partridge, you know, interviewing that boy Wonder, you know, and when he said, you know, oh, this is very unique, and the boy Partridge says, well, one cannot have gradations of unique. But for me, reality is somewhat similar. You know, either it's real or it's not. You know, you don't have 50 shades of reality, do you? You know, one of the things that fascinated me about Spare, when I first came across Spare's written work, I got very confused by the way that he uses the term ego, because of course, you know, in more modern days, we used to ego referring to our sense of self. You know, the sensation of me, I, mine, etc., etc., etc. And it took me a while to realise that what Spare meant by ego was the extent of the kia of which we're aware at any one time. And I found that interesting. I found that very interesting term. Racing through it. I mean, to be honest, I'm kind of going at a faster pace than is wise, you know, because like say, you get advance orders, you know, and then the book's published, and you have to send out advance orders, prepare a huge dispatch over to America, you know, then, you know, you're being flooded out with orders once it's published, and then just when it's all over, it's time to publish the next one. Still, I enjoy it. Keeps me off the street. Yes. Yeah, the latest one is Alistair Crowley and the Hidden God. What I did, you see, was I started out with a magical revival, and then I went for Outside the Circles of Time, simply because I knew from my emails that Circles was, for many people, the big one that they wanted. So I veered to Circles and then went back to AC and the Hidden God, and then from then on it would actually be in sequence of the original publication. So it's AC and the Hidden God now, and it will be Cults of the Shadow next, and then this year I should have time to squeeze in one more, which will be after Cults, which will be Outside of Eden. I'll just leave the last ones to do next year. But, do you know, the curious thing is that I mean, I let them be out of print for a lot longer than I should have, really, because we stored most of our stock in a warehouse, and in September 2017, the whole warehouse went up in smoke, and so our stock was totally destroyed. And so I was just kind of existing on locally held stock, you know, a small amount before things would actually go out of print. But when it came to the reprints, I seriously thought, well, you know, they're old books, demand won't be great, won't be really high. It'll just be a question of keeping them in print, and not at all. It's been like publishing new titles. It's been astonishing. Kenneth Grant has been acquiring, you know, a whole new readership. Actually, it's very, very interesting, and I honestly think the move into paperback will actually expand that readership quite a lot. And then eventually we'll go into ebooks, Kindle, and so forth, and make it, you know, much more affordable. I do, and it's very, very gratifying to you, because I sort of didn't really think it would happen in my lifetime. You know? I thought that these people coming along after I popped my clogs, my successors at lecture, would be sort of reaping the benefit. But it's very gratifying indeed. You know, because I believe passionately in Grant's work, so it's very gratifying for me when sort of other people get, you know, get steeped in it as well. I'll give you an illustration of that. I moved to London in the late 80s, and I was preparing the third issue of Starfire. And I'd gone round to visit Kenneth one day, and he said to me casually, you know, he said, would you be prepared to publish the Order's statement on Lamb in the issue? And so, you know, I said, yes, I will. And then he sort of remarked casually to me, he said, oh, you might sort of do a forward of 1 or 2 pages to it, you know. And I was really taken aback, because I had no interest whatever in Lamb at the time, you know, and it was a whole area that left me cold. And so I went and did what any sensible person would do, sat down, and my starting point was going through the indexes to the books. And the principle, the biggest number of references was in Outside the Circles of Time. Now, where I'd read, or tried to read, Outside the Circles of Time when it first came out in 1980. And I didn't get very far. After a few chapters, I thought, God, this is beyond me. You know, I was a very, very, very conservative person in those days. And so, you know, I put it aside. Well, when I was following up these index references to Lamb in there, I kept coming across these passages along the way. And I was reading them, I was thinking, my God, that's fantastic. And I couldn't believe that it was the same work that I'd hurled to the other side of the room in 1980. I felt quite ashamed of myself, actually. And so, yeah, perspectives do change, because, of course, I mean, it happens actually with all books, really, but in my view, to a much greater extent with books by Kenneth Grant, because since the last time you've read it, your perspectives have changed. You can draw a certain parallel to going and seeing a film repeatedly. Once your attention is off the main action in subsequent viewings, you notice all sorts of things that you didn't notice before. Plus, of course, when you're picking up a book, you've had all sorts of experience and sort of insights along the way. So things will mean completely different things to you than they meant the first time around, or the previous time that you read it. I mean, the book of Grants I read repeatedly is actually the novel Against the Light. And I mean, I must have read that hundreds of times when I take into account the number of times I read it when Kenneth first submitted it to me, the number of times I had to proofread it when it was actually going through the publication process, and the number of times that I've read it since. But I can honestly say that I find new things in it every time that I do. You know, quite apart from the fact that it's a bloody enthralling story. Very, very deep, very, very deep stuff. I really enjoy Grant's fiction, actually. Probably, I mean, apart from Against the Light, probably my favourite volume is The Other Child and Other Tales. And I love, I mean, there's some incredible short stories included in that volume, actually. The Amazement of Mandel and things like that. It's very good. I think his fiction is very, very underrated. I mean, for instance, I published Snake Wand in the year 2000 in an edition of 1,000 copies. And it only finally went out of print about a month, 6 weeks ago. Incredible, you know, it took so long. And yet, of course, now it's gone out of print, every other bugger wants to buy a copy. So, of course, the second-hand prices will be going up quite soon. But yeah, I think his fiction is very underrated indeed. In the jacket blurb to Snake Wand, for instance, Snake Wand in the Darkest Strain, for instance, he specifically refers to the siderealization of the participants in New Isis Lodge.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good night.